The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the downpour as Miguel Santos guided his taxi along the narrow coastal road outside Lisbon. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the rain had turned the asphalt into a black mirror, reflecting his headlights. That's when he saw her, standing at the edge of the pavement where the guardrail had long since rusted away. A woman in a flowing white dress, her dark hair plastered against her pale face, one arm extended as if beckoning for help. Miguel slowed down. Something about her stillness troubled him, the way she didn't flinch against the driving rain. But she needed help, clearly, and so he pulled over. When he looked up again, the roadside was empty. Just rain and mist and the sound of waves crashing against rocks somewhere below in the darkness. What Miguel didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he had just joined millions of witnesses across every inhabited continent who have seen the exact same figure. She goes by many names. The White Lady, La Dama Blanca Tartugui, the woman in white. But always, she appears the same, pale as death, dressed in flowing white, mournful, silent, and always near water or along lonely roads where the living dare to travel at night. Tonight, we're going to visit 6 locations where the White Lady walks. 6 places separated by oceans and centuries, yet connected by a phenomenon that defies rational explanation. From the fog-shrouded castles of Europe to the rain-soaked highways of Asia, from colonial mansions in the Americas to ancient crossroads in Africa, we'll follow her trail. And what we'll discover is more than ghost stories. These are cultural touchstones, psychological mirrors, mysteries that reveal something fundamental about human fear and collective memory. Because here's what makes the White Lady different from other supernatural phenomena. She doesn't change. Cultures adapt their monsters, reshape their legends to fit new contexts. But the White Lady remains constant, as if she exists beyond culture itself. The question isn't whether you believe in ghosts. The question is why the same ghost appears everywhere. The rain came down in sheets that night in 1964, turning White Rock Lake into a churning mass of darkness against the Dallas skyline. A young man whose name has been recorded in some accounts as simply Bob was driving along the winding road that hugs the eastern shore of the lake, his headlights cutting through the downpour as his windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the dew. He was thinking about getting home, about the warm apartment waiting for him, when his headlights caught something that made him slam on his brakes. A woman stood at the side of the road, completely drenched, her white evening gown clinging to her body like a second skin. Even through the rain and darkness, Bob could see that she was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair plastered against her pale face. She wasn't holding her arms up for warmth or trying to shield herself from the rain. She simply stood there, motionless, staring at his car with an expression he would later describe as desperate beyond words. Bob pulled over without hesitation. What kind of person would leave a woman stranded in weather like this, dressed for a party and clearly in some kind of distress? He leaned across and pushed open the passenger door, and she climbed in without saying a word of thanks. Water pooled immediately on the seat beneath her, and he noticed with a strange mixture of concern and confusion that she was shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them over the sound of the rain hammering on the roof of his car. He asked her what had happened, where she needed to go. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, hoarse and strained, as if speaking required tremendous effort. She gave him an address on Gaston Avenue, a residential neighborhood not far from the lake. Bob knew the area well enough. He put the car back in gear and pulled onto the road, glancing over at his passenger every few seconds. She stared straight ahead, never meeting his eyes, her hands folded in her lap. The white fabric of her dress was so wet, it had turned nearly transparent in places, and he tried not to stare, tried to focus on the road and getting this poor woman to wherever she needed to be. He attempted conversation, asking if she had been at a party near the lake, if her car had broken down, if she needed him to call anyone once they reached her home. She answered none of his questions. The only sound from her side of the car was that persistent chattering of teeth and the occasional soft dripping of water onto the floorboard. The silence grew heavy, uncomfortable, and Bob found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Something about her presence felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, even to himself. The temperature in the car seemed to have dropped despite the heater running at full blast, and he realized he could see his breath forming small clouds in the air. They had driven perhaps 2 miles from where he picked her up, still several minutes from the address she had given, when Bob glanced over one more time to check on his passenger. The seat beside him was empty, completely empty. He nearly drove off the road in his shock, jerking the wheel hard and pulling to a stop on the shoulder. His heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the vacant passenger seat, at the puddle of water that remained where she had been sitting just seconds before. The door was still closed, still locked. He had heard no sound of it opening, no rush of wind or rain from outside. She had simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all, except for the water. The seat was soaking wet, water still dripping onto the floor, in a steady rhythm that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Bob sat there for a long time, his hands shaking, before he finally worked up the courage to drive to the address she had given him on Gaston Avenue. He had to know. He had to understand what had just happened. When he arrived at the house and knocked on the door, an elderly woman answered. Bob stumbled through his story, his words coming out in a confused rush. The woman's face grew pale as he described his passenger, the white evening gown, the desperate look in her eyes. She invited him inside and showed him a photograph on the mantel. It was the woman from his car, exactly as he had seen her, down to the style of her dark hair and the cut of her dress. The elderly woman told him the photograph had been taken at a party in 1938, 26 years earlier. The young woman in the picture was her daughter, and she had drowned in White Rock Lake on the night that photograph was taken. This encounter, this specific incident from 1964, became the most famous and well-documented account of what locals would come to call the Lady of White Rock Lake. But it was far from the first, and it would be far from the last. The story of the drowning itself has become as much a part of Dallas folklore as the ghost sightings that followed, though the exact details shift depending on who tells the tale. According to the most commonly repeated version of events, a young woman attended a party near the lake on a warm summer evening in the late 1930s. She was engaged to be married, radiant in her white dress, dancing and laughing with friends as the night grew long. At some point, she and her fiancé decided to take a rowboat out onto the calm waters of the lake. Some accounts say they had been drinking, that the boat overturned when they stood up to embrace. Others claim the boat struck something in the dark water, a submerged log or rock that tore through the hull. The fiancé managed to swim to shore, but the young woman, weighed down by her heavy dress, sank beneath the surface before anyone could reach her. They found her body 3 days later, still wearing the white gown that had become her shroud. But even this origin story has variations. Some longtime Dallas residents insist the drowning happened in the late 1920s, not the 30s. Others claim there were multiple drownings of young women at White Rock Lake during that era. And the ghost represents not one woman but several, their tragic ends merging into a single spectral presence. A few skeptics have pointed out that searches through old newspaper archives have failed to turn up any definitive report of such a drowning, though records from that period are admittedly incomplete. What cannot be disputed is the sheer number of sightings reported over the decades since that first alleged drowning. The 1964 encounter may be the most famous, but it exists within a vast collection of similar testimonies spanning generations. In the early 1940s, a taxi driver reported picking up a young woman in a white dress near the lake, who vanished from his cab before reaching her destination. In the 1950s, at least 3 different motorists came forward with nearly identical stories, all describing a soaking wet woman in white, who asked for a ride home and disappeared en route. The pattern was always the same: the location near White Rock Lake, the white dress or gown, the water, the sudden vanishing, and often the journey to an address where grieving family members confirmed the identity of someone long dead. The sightings continued through the 1970s and 80s. A police officer in 1976 filed an official report after seeing a woman matching the description walking along the lake road late at night. When he stopped to offer assistance, she walked directly toward the lake and, according to his account, continued walking into the water without hesitation, disappearing beneath the surface without a splash or ripple. When he called for backup and they searched the area, they found nothing. A young couple parked near the lake in 1981 claimed a wet woman in white knocked on their car window, her face pressed against the glass, before fading away like morning mist. What makes these accounts particularly compelling from a folkloric perspective is their consistency. Ghost stories typically evolve and change dramatically over time, with details shifting to match the era and the teller. But the Lady of White Rock Lake has remained remarkably stable in her description across more than half a century of reported encounters. She is always young, always beautiful in a haunting way, always wearing white, always soaking wet, and always trying to get home. The desperation in her demeanor is mentioned again and again by witnesses, that quality of urgent need that compels strangers to stop and help despite the late hour and the strange circumstances. Psychologists who study urban legends and ghost stories have noted that the vanishing hitchhiker is one of the most persistent and widespread folkloric motifs in human culture. The phantom passenger who disappears from a moving vehicle represents something primal in the human psyche, a manifestation of our complicated relationship with death, loss, and the impossibility of return. These stories often emerge from real tragedies, from deaths that seem particularly unfair or untimely, as if the collective consciousness of a community needs to process the loss through repeated retellings. White Rock Lake itself carries an atmosphere that seems to invite such legends. The man-made reservoir, completed in 1911, covers more than 1,000 acres and has been the site of numerous drownings and accidents over the decades. The roads that wind around its shores are dark and isolated in places. The lake serves as both a beloved recreational area for Dallas residents and a kind of liminal space where the boundary between the everyday world and something stranger seems thin and permeable. The enduring power of the Lady of White Rock Lake lies not just in the ghost story itself, but in what it reveals about how communities create and maintain their mythology. Every person who claims to have encountered her becomes part of an ongoing narrative, a thread in a tapestry that connects past and present. Whether these encounters represent genuine supernatural experiences, misidentifications, or deliberate fabrications matters less than the fact that people continue to tell the story, continue to feel a connection to this eternal young woman who cannot find her way home. She has become a permanent part of Dallas identity, as recognizable to locals as any landmark or historical event, a reminder that some losses resonate so deeply they echo through generations, carried forward on the lips of strangers who keep the drowned woman's memory alive by refusing to let her rest. The stone walls of Newhouse Castle rise from the Bohemian countryside like a monument to both power and sorrow. For more than 500 years, visitors to this fortress have reported encounters with a spectral figure that drifts through its corridors. A woman dressed entirely in white, whose appearance carries a terrible message. She is no ordinary ghost. According to those who have witnessed her, she wears gloves that telegraph the future itself. White gloves signal a peaceful death approaches within the family. Black gloves mean violence is coming. This is the White Lady of Newhouse, and her story reveals how medieval tragedy transformed into supernatural warning, creating an archetype that would haunt the imagination of Europe and eventually spread across the entire world. To understand the White Lady, we must travel back to the 15th century, to a world where noble marriages were political transactions and women were currency in games of power. Perkta of Rosenberg was born into one of the most influential families in Bohemia, a dynasty whose wealth rivaled that of kings. The Rosenberg line controlled vast estates, commanded armies, and shaped the fate of the Holy Roman Empire itself. But for all their power, they could not protect their daughter from the brutal realities of aristocratic life. The historical records tell us that Perkta was married against her will to Johann von Liechtenstein, a union arranged to strengthen political alliances between powerful houses. The chronicles of the era paint a disturbing picture. Johann was known for his violent temper, his cruelty, and his complete disregard for his young bride. What should have been a life of privilege became a prison of fear and suffering. Perkta lived in Newhouse Castle, surrounded by luxury yet trapped in misery, her days marked by abuse that the society of her time dismissed as a husband's prerogative. The castle itself became the stage for her torment. Imagine walking these same halls where she once moved, knowing that each stone corridor witnessed her tears, that each grand chamber echoed with arguments and violence. The medieval fortress was designed to keep enemies out, But for Perta, it kept her locked in with her tormentor. Servants whispered about the screams that came from the noble quarters. Other members of the Rosenberg family knew of her suffering, but were powerless or unwilling to intervene. This was the way of the world in the 1400s, where family honor and political necessity outweighed individual happiness. According to legend, Perchta's breaking point came after years of enduring Johann's abuse. Some versions of the story claim she was accused of adultery, a convenient charge that husbands often leveled against wives they wished to dispose of. Others say she was simply worn down by the relentless cruelty, her spirit shattered by a life devoid of love or kindness. What the accounts agree upon is what happened next. On her deathbed, whether from illness, injury, or a broken heart, Percha summoned the last reserves of her strength and pronounced a curse upon the Rosenberg line and all families connected to them through marriage. The curse itself has been passed down through generations. Perchta declared that she would never rest, that she would return to warn her family whenever death approached. She would appear as a harbinger, a messenger from beyond the grave, forever bound to the bloodline that had condemned her to such suffering. The white gloves would signal a natural death, perhaps the only mercy she could offer. The black gloves foretold murder, violence, the same brutality that had defined her own existence. With these words, Perchta died, and the legend of the White Lady was born. The first reported sighting came shortly after her death. Family members claimed to see a woman in flowing white robes moving through the castle at night, her face pale as moonlight, her hands covered in pristine white gloves. Within days, an elderly relative passed away peacefully in sleep. The coincidence unsettled the household, but it was dismissed as grief-stricken imagination. Then she appeared again and again, each manifestation followed by another death in the family. The pattern became undeniable. The White Lady was keeping her promise. Over the centuries, the sightings accumulated into an extensive documented history. Unlike many ghost stories that blur into vague folklore, the White Lady accounts are remarkably specific and consistent. In 1562, she appeared to multiple witnesses wearing black gloves before Wilhelm von Rosenberg was attacked by political enemies. In 1614, servants saw her in white gloves ascending the castle stairs 2 nights before the peaceful death of the family matriarch. The records continue through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, an unbroken chain of supernatural warnings that became woven into the family's identity. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their documentation by credible witnesses. We are not talking about superstitious peasants or attention-seeking storytellers. Castle guards, visiting nobles, and even skeptical family members reported encounters with the White Lady. They described her appearance in remarkable detail, her sorrowful expression, her silent movement through solid walls, the way she seemed to glide rather than walk. Most striking were the gloves, always noticed, always remembered. Their color burned into the memory of those who saw them. The phenomenon was not confined to Neuhaus Castle alone. As the Rosenberg line intermarried with other noble families across Bohemia and Germany, reports of the White Lady began emerging from other castles and estates. She appeared at Krumlov Castle in southern Bohemia, at various Liechtenstein holdings, anywhere the bloodline extended. The curse, it seemed, traveled with the family, an inheritance more powerful than titles or wealth. Psychologically, we can understand the White Lady legend as a manifestation of collective guilt and trauma. The Rosenberg family carried the weight of Perchta's suffering, a stain that could not be washed away by time or denial. Her ghost served as a reminder that injustice leaves scars that transcend death itself. For the family members, each appearance forced them to confront the sins of their ancestors, to acknowledge that their power and privilege were built partly on the misery of an innocent woman. The color-coded gloves added a layer of moral judgment to the haunting. A natural death earned white, a final kindness. Violence brought black, a reflection of the brutality that had started the curse. But the White Lady of Neuhaus represents more than one family's ghost story. She is the most famous example of a much broader European tradition, one that stretches back to pre-Christian times and forward into the modern era. Across the continent, from Ireland to Russia, legends tell of women in white who appear as death omens. These figures go by many names: Bean Sidhi in Ireland, La Llorona in Spanish territories, the numerous unnamed white ladies who haunt castles, crossroads, and ancient sites throughout Europe. The archetype is remarkably consistent: a woman wronged in life, often by men, who returns in death as a harbinger or avenger. Medieval Europe provided fertile ground for such legends to flourish. This was an era obsessed with death, when plague could wipe out entire villages and violence was a constant threat. People needed systems to make sense of mortality, to find patterns in the chaos. The appearance of a supernatural figure before death provided both warning and meaning. If the White Lady appears, death is not random but announced, acknowledged, even explained. This gave communities a sense of control, however illusory, over forces they could not comprehend or prevent. The cultural exchange that spread these legends across Europe was facilitated by the interconnected nature of medieval nobility. Noble families intermarried across kingdoms, carrying their stories and superstitions with them. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers spread tales from region to region. Monasteries copied manuscripts that preserved ghost stories alongside religious texts. By the time the age of colonization began, the White Lady archetype was deeply embedded in European consciousness, ready to be exported to every corner of the globe where European powers extended their reach. Today, variations of the White Lady legend can be found on every inhabited continent. In the Americas, Spanish colonizers brought their own versions of women in white, which blended with indigenous beliefs to create new hybrid legends. British colonization spread the tradition to Australia, India, and Africa. Each culture adapted the archetype to local contexts, but the core remained: a female ghost in white, associated with death, often connected to historical tragedy. The global dominance of this particular supernatural figure speaks to both the reach of European colonization and the universal human experiences of injustice, grief, and mortality that the White Lady represents. The story of Perchta of Rosenberg continues to captivate because it combines historical tragedy with supernatural consequence. It reminds us that the past is never truly past, that suffering echoes forward through time, demanding recognition and remembrance. Whether we believe in ghosts or not, the White Lady serves a vital cultural function. She is a repository of memory, a warning against cruelty, and a symbol of how violence, particularly against women, leaves wounds that societies struggle to heal. Her white and black gloves offer a moral framework, a cosmic justice system that operates beyond the reach of earthly law. The rain comes down in sheets over Quezon City, hammering the asphalt until the streets shine like black mirrors under the flickering streetlights. It's past midnight on Balete Drive, a curved stretch of road cutting through one of Manila's oldest residential districts, where the ancient Balete trees once stood so thick their roots buckled the pavement and their canopies blocked out the sun. The taxi drivers know this road well, too well perhaps, and on nights like this when the rain falls hard and the clock pushes past midnight, many of them will take the long way around, adding 15 or 20 minutes to their route, rather than drive this particular stretch of asphalt between the witching hours. Ask them why, and if they trust you enough to tell the truth, they will describe the woman in white. She appears without warning, always on rainy nights, always between midnight and 3 in the morning. One moment the back seat is empty, visible in the rearview mirror as nothing but cracked vinyl and shadow. The next moment, she is simply there, as if she had been sitting in that spot all along, and the driver had somehow failed to notice. A beautiful woman, they say, with long black hair that hangs wet and heavy down her back, droplets falling onto the white dress that clings to her figure. Her face is turned toward the window at first, watching the rain-streaked streets slide past, and when the drivers see her materialize in their mirrors, their first instinct is shock at having somehow picked up a passenger they don't remember stopping for. But the fear comes later, in those terrible moments when she slowly turns her head to meet their eyes in the reflection. The accounts have remained remarkably consistent since the earliest documented reports from the 1950s. A taxi driver named Eduardo Mendoza filed a statement with the Quezon City Police in 1953, claiming that a woman in a white dress appeared in his vehicle as he drove down what was then simply called the Boulevard near the old Balete tree. He described her as hauntingly beautiful at first glance, with pale skin and delicate features. She asked him to take her to the end of the road in a soft voice that he could barely hear over the rain. But as he drove, watching her in his mirror, he noticed her face beginning to change. The eyes grew larger, rounder, bulging slightly from their sockets. The mouth stretched wider, the lips pulling back to reveal too many teeth, sharp and white. The skin seemed to lose its smoothness, becoming mottled and strange. When he slammed on the brakes and turned to confront her, the back seat was empty, the vinyl still dry despite her soaking wet dress. The police dismissed his report as the imaginings of a man who had been drinking, or perhaps had fallen asleep at the wheel and experienced a vivid nightmare. But the stories continued, year after year, decade after decade, with the same details repeated by drivers who had never met each other, who had no connection beyond having driven down this particular road on rainy nights. In 1967, a jeepney driver named Carlos Santiago told his family about the woman who appeared behind him during a midnight run. His story matched Eduardo's almost exactly. The white dress, the wet hair, the beautiful face that transformed into something monstrous before she vanished. Carlos was so shaken by the experience that he refused to drive at night for the rest of his life, giving up the more lucrative evening routes that had helped feed his 6 children. The 1970s and 80s brought more reports, more witnesses, more frightened drivers who found themselves unable to explain what they had seen. The phenomenon became so well known among Manila's taxi and jeepney drivers that unofficial rules developed. Don't drive Balete Drive between midnight and 3 if you can help it. If you must drive it, don't look in your rearview mirror. If something appears in your back seat, don't meet its eyes. Keep driving, keep your gaze forward, and pray that it disappears before the transformation completes. But what makes people continue to drive this route despite the stories? Economics, primarily. Balete Drive connects several major thoroughfares, and avoiding it means losing time and fuel, which translates directly to lost income for drivers working the night shift. So they take their chances, some muttering prayers as they enter the curve, others hanging rosaries and religious images from their mirrors, hoping these talismans will protect them from whatever haunts this stretch of road. The descriptions of the transformation remain most disturbing element of the accounts. Witnesses report that the change happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The beautiful woman's face begins to shift, her features elongating and distorting. Her eyes grow wider, darker, until they seem to fill half her face. Her mouth stretches into an impossible grin, revealing row after row of needle-like teeth. Some drivers report that her neck elongates grotesquely, allowing her head to tilt at unnatural angles. Others describe her skin becoming translucent, revealing something dark and writhing beneath. The wet black hair seems to move independently, twisting and coiling like living serpents around her shoulders. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she is gone, leaving behind nothing but the memory of her face and sometimes a wet spot on the seat where she had been sitting. Theories about the woman's origin have evolved over the decades, each attempting to explain why this particular spirit haunts this particular stretch of road with such consistency. The most commonly cited explanation connects her to the atrocities committed during the Japanese occupation of Manila from 1942 to 1945. This area of Quezon City saw intense fighting during the Battle of Manila in 1945, one of the most brutal urban conflicts of World War II. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians died during that month-long battle, many of them women and children caught between the retreating Japanese forces and the advancing American and Philippine Commonwealth troops. Local historians have documented numerous accounts of Japanese soldiers committing atrocities against Filipino women in this neighborhood during the occupation. Some believe the woman in white represents one of these victims, condemned to endlessly repeat her final journey along this road, her transformation from beauty to horror, reflecting the violence inflicted upon her. The white dress, in this interpretation, is a burial gown, and her appearance only on rainy nights recalls the monsoon rains that fell during those terrible months of 1945, when the city burned and the streets ran with blood. But others point to older, deeper roots for the haunting. Long before the Japanese occupation, before American colonization, before even the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the Balete tree held a special significance in Filipino spiritual beliefs. These massive strangler figs were considered dwelling places for spirits, particularly the Dawada, nature spirits who could appear as beautiful women, but who possessed great power and could be dangerous if offended. The white dress recalls the traditional garments of these spirits, and their ability to transform from beautiful to terrifying mirrors, the dual nature of the Dewata, who could be benevolent protectors or vengeful destroyers, depending on how humans treated the natural world they guarded. The original Balete Drive was named for an enormous Balete tree that once stood at the curve in the road, its aerial roots hanging down like a curtain and its canopy spreading across the entire width of the street. According to local elders, this tree was already ancient when the Americans laid out this neighborhood in the early 20th century. Its trunk so massive that 3 men with arms outstretched could not encircle it. The tree was cut down in the 1960s to widen the road and improve traffic flow, but not before workers reported strange occurrences during the cutting. Tools that disappeared, ropes that snapped without explanation, and a pervasive sense of being watched from within the tree's hollow trunk. Some residents who remember the old tree claim the hauntings intensified after it was cut down, as if the removal of the Balete had angered the spirit who dwelled within it, or perhaps had released her to wander the road where her tree once stood. In this interpretation, the woman in white is not a war victim, but something far older, a Dewata seeking vengeance for the destruction of her ancient home, transforming her face to terrify those who use the road built through her destroyed domain. Modern witnesses continue to report encounters that match the classic pattern. In 2008, a taxi driver named Ramon Cruz captured national attention when he reported his experience to a popular radio show. He described the woman appearing in his back seat during a heavy rainstorm just after 1 in the morning. He saw her face transform in his mirror, watching in frozen horror as her beauty twisted into monstrosity. When he pulled over and fled his cab, he discovered that his dashboard camera, which he had recently installed to protect against robbery, had been running during the encounter. But when he reviewed the footage, it showed only an empty back seat and his own terrified face in the mirror, reacting to something the camera could not capture. This raises perhaps the most unsettling question about the woman in white. Is she a ghost? A spirit that exists independently of those who witness her? Or is she something else, a vision that appears only in the minds of her victims, leaving no physical trace, but creating experiences so vivid and consistent that they might as well be real? The psychological impact on witnesses is undeniably real. Several drivers have required counseling after their encounters, unable to shake the image of that transforming face. Some have abandoned their vehicles and never driven professionally again. Others continue to work, but develop elaborate rituals and routes to avoid Balete Drive during the dangerous hours, their careers permanently shaped by a few moments of terror on a rain-slicked road. And still she appears, year after year, decade after decade, her story passed down from old drivers to new ones, a warning and a mystery that refuses to be solved or forgotten. On rainy nights in Quezon City, when the clock approaches midnight and the streets empty of all but those who must travel, the question hangs in the humid air like the mist rising from the wet pavement. Will tonight be the night she appears again? And whose eyes will meet hers in the rearview mirror, watching helplessly as beauty transforms into horror in the flickering light of the street lamps along Balete Drive? Ah, my dial. In the darkness of a well at Himeji Castle, something still counts. Visitors who press their ears against the ancient stones report hearing a soft, mournful voice rising from the depths. 1, 2, 3. The counting never reaches 10. It always stops at 9, followed by a wail that seems to tear through the fabric of the night itself. This is the domain of Okiku, and her story has shaped the very essence of Japanese horror for over 4 centuries. Around the year 1600, during Japan's early Edo period, a young servant girl named Okiku worked in the household of a samurai master. The exact location varies depending on which version of the tale you follow. Some say it happened at Himeji Castle in Hyogo Prefecture, while others place it at the residence of a samurai family in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. But the core of the story remains consistent across all tellings, and it is this consistency that has allowed the legend to endure through generations. Okiku was known for her beauty and her loyalty. She performed her duties with diligence, maintaining the household and caring for the family's most precious possessions. Among these treasures were 10 valuable plates, heirlooms of extraordinary worth that had been passed down through the samurai family for generations. These were not ordinary dishes, but works of art, delicate porcelain pieces that represented both monetary value and familial honor. The responsibility of caring for these plates fell to Okiku, and she treated this duty with the utmost seriousness. The samurai master, whose name changes across different versions but whose character remains consistently malevolent, developed an obsession with his young servant. He desired her, but Okiku refused his advances. She was a woman of principle, and despite her lowly status, she would not compromise her dignity, not even for the man who held power over her life. This rejection ignited a dangerous fury in the samurai's heart. He was a man accustomed to having his desires fulfilled, a warrior whose word was law within his household. Her refusal was not just a personal slight but a challenge to his authority. The samurai devised a cruel scheme to force Okiku into compliance. He took one of the 10 precious plates and hid it, then summoned Okiku and demanded she count the plates in his presence. She began with confidence, her voice steady as she counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. She counted again, confusion creeping into her movements. Again the count stopped at 9. The blood drained from her face as she realized what this meant. The samurai watched her panic with cold satisfaction. He accused her of breaking or stealing the missing plate, a crime that carried severe punishment. The loss of such a valuable family heirloom could mean death, or at the very least, a fate worse than death for a servant girl with no family to protect her. But the samurai offered her an alternative. Become his mistress, he told her, and he would forget about the missing plate. He would protect her from the consequences of her supposed crime. Okiku refused again. Even facing death, even knowing the horrible fate that awaited her, she would not surrender to his coercion. Her defiance sealed her doom. In his rage, the samurai either killed her outright or beat her so severely that she died from her injuries. The accounts vary, but all agree on what happened next. He threw her body down the well, disposing of her like refuse. Her life extinguished for nothing more than maintaining her integrity in the face of power. But death was not the end of Okiku's story. It was merely the beginning of her transformation into something far more terrifying than the samurai could have imagined. On the night following her murder, servants in the household began to hear sounds coming from the well. A woman's voice, soft and ghostly, rose from the depths where Okiku's body lay broken and abandoned. The voice was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in a row. Then, silence. Then a scream, a wail of such profound anguish and rage that it froze the blood of everyone who heard it. Night after night, the counting continued. The household could not escape it. The ghost of Okiku emerged from the well after dark, her form materializing in the moonlight. She wore white funeral robes, the traditional dress of the dead in Japanese culture. Her long black hair hung wet and tangled around her pale face, water dripping endlessly from the strands as if she had just risen from the depth. Her hands reached out before her, fingers moving as she counted plates that existed only in the realm of her eternal torment. The image of Okiku's ghost became the template for the yurei, the vengeful spirits that populate Japanese folklore and continue to haunt modern horror cinema. She embodied specific visual elements that would become standard in depictions of female ghosts throughout Japanese culture. The white kimono represents death and mourning. The long, disheveled black hair speaks to the breakdown of social order and propriety, as well-groomed hair was a sign of proper living women. The wetness, the constant dripping of water, connects these spirits to wells, rivers, and other bodies of water where so many met untimely deaths. The samurai who murdered Okiku received different fates depending on which version of the tale you follow. In some accounts he went mad from the nightly counting and the terrible wail that followed, eventually taking his own life to escape the haunting. In others, he died under mysterious circumstances, found dead near the well with an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. Some versions claim he confessed his crime and died in disgrace, but in all tellings, Okiku's vengeance was complete. The well at Himeji Castle is identified by many as the actual site of Okiku's death, and it remains a destination for those fascinated by the supernatural. The castle itself is one of Japan's most magnificent surviving feudal structures, a sprawling complex of white walls and elegant architecture that dates back to the 1400s. Among its many chambers, gardens, and defensive structures lies a simple well, unremarkable except for the wooden sign that identifies it as Okiku's well. Modern visitors to the castle report strange experiences near this well. The sounds of counting and weeping are most commonly heard during rain, when water fills the air with the same dampness that clings to Okiku's ghostly form. Some claim to hear the voice rising from the depths even on clear days, a soft feminine counting that stops at 9 and dissolves into sobs. Others report feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness when they approach, as if the well itself radiates the grief and injustice of what occurred there centuries ago. The park rangers and castle staff, according to local accounts, give the well a wide berth after darkness falls. They refuse to perform maintenance or inspections near the site once the sun goes down. Whether this is due to genuine supernatural concerns or simply respect for a powerful cultural legend, the effect is the same. The well remains undisturbed in the darkness, left to whatever presence might linger there. The story of Okiku influenced Japanese horror aesthetics in ways that extend far beyond simple ghost stories told around campfires. Her image appears again and again in Japanese theater, literature, and art throughout the centuries following her death. The traditional kabuki play Bancho Sarayashiki tells her story to audiences who still find the tale compelling. Ukiyo-e, artists created woodblock prints depicting her rising from the well, her ghostly form captured in stark lines and shadows. In modern cinema, Okiku's legacy is unmistakable. The vengeful female spirits that appear in films like Ringu and Ju-on bear her characteristics. They emerge from water or damp places. They wear white. Their hair hangs wet and wild. They seek revenge for wrongful deaths, particularly deaths connected to male violence or betrayal. These are not random aesthetic choices but direct inheritance from Okiku's story and the Yurei tradition she represents. The psychological power of Okiku's tale lies in its exploration of injustice and powerlessness. She was a servant, someone without social standing or protection. She was a woman in a patriarchal society where her wishes and her bodily autonomy meant nothing compared to her master's desires. She did everything right, maintained her integrity, and performed her duties faithfully, yet she was destroyed anyway. Her story resonates because it acknowledges a fundamental human fear that doing the right thing is not always enough to protect us from those who hold power over our lives. Her endless counting represents the impossibility of resolution. She can never reach 10. She can never complete the task that was used to destroy her. Her vengeance, while terrible, brings her no peace. This is the true horror of the Yurei. These spirits are not just frightening because they harm the living, but because they are themselves trapped in eternal suffering. Okiku cannot move on, cannot find rest, cannot escape the moment of her betrayal and murder. She is frozen in her trauma, replaying it forever in the darkness of the well. Today, the well at Himeji Castle stands as a tangible connection to this legend. Whether Okiku was a real person or an amalgamation of many wronged women whose stories have been lost to time, her legacy persists. The well remains, the counting continues in the minds of those who know the story, and the image of a wet-haired woman in white robes has become one of the most recognizable figures in horror worldwide. From a samurai's household in 1600 to modern horror films that terrify audiences across the globe, Okiku counts on. Her voice echoing through the centuries, stopping always at 9, followed by that bone-chilling wail that speaks to an injustice that can never be corrected, only remembered. The Stevenson Expressway cuts through the southwestern edge of Chicago like a surgical scar, and on particularly cold nights, when fog rolls in from Lake Michigan and settles over the asphalt in thick, oppressive waves, drivers still report seeing her. A young woman in a white party dress, standing impossibly still at the side of the road near Archer Avenue, one pale arm extended with her thumb pointing hopefully toward the city lights. Those who have stopped, and there have been dozens over the decades, all describe the same thing. She is beautiful in an old-fashioned way, with blonde hair styled in waves that seem to belong to another era entirely. Her dress is white and formal, the kind a girl might wear to a dance in the 1930s or 40s. And on her feet are delicate dancing shoes completely unsuited for the weather. When she slides into the back seat of your car, witnesses claim the temperature drops so suddenly that you can see your breath crystallize in the air before you. Her name, according to those who have pieced together the fragments of this story, is Mary. Though some call her Resurrection Mary, after the cemetery where her story both begins and ends, a sprawling Catholic burial ground on Archer Avenue that has stood watch over the dead since 1864. The legend has persisted for nearly 90 years now, making it one of the longest-running and best-documented ghost stories in American history. But this is not merely folklore passed down through generations of teenagers looking to scare each other on Halloween. This is something else entirely. Something that left physical evidence. Something that dozens of credible witnesses, including Chicago police officers, have sworn under oath they encountered. The core narrative remains consistent across decades of sightings, which is itself unusual in the world of ghost stories. Legends tend to mutate and evolve, details changing with each retelling until the original story becomes unrecognizable. But not this one. Since the early 1930s, people have reported picking up a young woman matching Mary's exact description along Archer Avenue. She never speaks much, witnesses say. She seems distracted, distant, as though part of her attention is focused on something the driver cannot see. Her skin, when accidentally brushed, feels impossibly cold, like touching marble in winter. She always asks to be taken north toward the city, but she never makes it to her destination. As the car approaches Resurrection Cemetery, something changes. Some witnesses report that she suddenly becomes agitated, pressing her face against the window as though recognizing something in the darkness beyond. Others say she simply vanishes without warning, there one moment and gone the next, leaving only a damp spot on the upholstery and a lingering smell of decay mixed incongruously with perfume. A few drivers, the ones who perhaps grip the steering wheel a little tighter when they tell the story, claim they watched in their rearview mirror as she opened the car door while the vehicle was still moving and leaped out, running at an impossible speed toward the cemetery gates before disappearing entirely. The earliest documented sightings date back to 1934, though some researchers believe the phenomenon may have begun even earlier. A cab driver named Ralph reported picking up a young woman in a white dress near the O. Henry Ballroom, a popular dance hall that once stood at the corner of Archer Avenue and 52nd Street. She gave an address on the south side, sat quietly in the back seat, and then, as they passed Resurrection Cemetery, she screamed for him to stop. When he turned around, the back seat was empty. The door had never opened. Ralph filed a report with his cab company, convinced someone was playing an elaborate prank on him. But the report went nowhere. Who would believe such a story? But Ralph was only the first. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, reports multiplied. A night watchman named Jerry Pallas claimed he met a beautiful blonde woman at a dance at the Liberty Grove and Hall in 1939. They danced for hours, he said, and though he noticed she felt cold when he held her, he attributed it to the chilly autumn evening. She agreed to let him drive her home and gave him an address on the north side. But as they drove past Resurrection Cemetery, she asked him to stop. She needed to get out here, she said, and when he protested that this was a cemetery, not a residence, she simply opened the door and walked toward the gates. He watched, confused, as she passed directly through the closed iron bars as though they were made of smoke. Jerry tried to follow up on the address she had given him the next day. The woman who answered the door listened to his description and began to cry. That was her daughter, she said, but her daughter had been dead for years. She was buried in Resurrection Cemetery. The police began taking the reports more seriously in the 1970s. By then, the sightings had become so frequent that officers patrolling the Archer Avenue area had developed a routine for handling calls about the vanishing hitchhiker. They would take statements, file reports, and quietly file them away in a growing folder that the department didn't quite know what to do with. The witnesses were credible, often solid citizens with no history of mental illness or attention-seeking behavior. They were shaken, genuinely frightened by what they had experienced. But what could the police do? You cannot arrest a ghost. Then came 1976, and everything changed. On a cold night in August of that year, a passing motorist noticed something alarming near the gates of Resurrection Cemetery and immediately called the police. Someone, he said, was trapped inside the cemetery after hours. He could see a young woman in a white dress gripping the iron bars of the gate, desperately trying to pull them apart. The bars themselves appeared to be bent, as though someone with incredible strength had grabbed them and tried to pry the gates open. Officers arrived within minutes, but the woman was gone. What remained, however, could not be easily dismissed. The iron bars of the gate, each one as thick as a man's wrist and made of old-growth wrought iron that had stood firm for over a century, were bent outward in 2 places. The metal had not simply been pushed or pulled. It had been gripped, squeezed with such force that the shape of 2 small hands was clearly visible in the metal itself. But it was not the bent bars that disturbed the officers most. It was the handprints burned into the metal, blackened impressions that looked as though someone had grabbed iron heated to an impossible temperature and held on until the metal retained the image of their desperate grip. The cemetery management was contacted immediately. They had no explanation. The gate had been locked and secure when they had closed the cemetery that evening. No one should have been inside. The handprints were approximately the size that would fit a young woman, and they were positioned at about shoulder height for someone of average female stature. The burns appeared to penetrate into the metal itself, not merely scorching the surface, but changing the molecular structure of the iron in ways that engineers later admitted they could not easily explain. The story hit the local newspapers within days, and Resurrection Cemetery was suddenly flooded with curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators. People came from across the country to photograph the bent bars and the mysterious handprints. The cemetery management, overwhelmed and concerned about the disruption to the peaceful grounds, made a decision that would only deepen the mystery. They removed the damaged section of the gate entirely, replacing it with new bars and disposing of the old ones. They claimed they were simply maintaining the cemetery's appearance, but to believers in the Resurrection Mary legend, this looked, suspiciously, like a cover-up. The removal of the physical evidence did nothing to stop the sightings. If anything, they intensified. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, dozens more witnesses came forward with their stories. A young couple driving home from a wedding in 1977 reported picking up a blonde woman in a white dress who vanished from their locked car. A bus driver in 1980 claimed she boarded his bus, dropped exact change into the fare box without speaking, and disappeared before reaching the next stop. A group of teenagers in 1983 saw her standing in the middle of Archer Avenue, directly in their path. The driver swerved to avoid hitting her and crashed into a telephone pole. When they looked back, the road was empty. Researchers attempting to identify the real person behind the legend have focused their attention on several women buried in Resurrection Cemetery who match the description. The most promising candidate is Mary Bregovy, a young Polish woman who died in a car accident in 1934 after a night of dancing at the O. Henry Ballroom. She was 21 years old, blonde, and was buried in a white dress and dancing shoes. Her grave is located not far from the main gates on Archer Avenue. Another possibility is Anna Norkus, who died in a similar accident in 1927 at the age of 13. Though younger than the woman witnesses describe, some researchers note that ghosts might appear as they wish to be seen, not as they were at death. But perhaps the most compelling candidate is a woman whose name has been lost to time entirely. Cemetery records from the 1920s and 30s are incomplete, and several young women who match the general description were buried there during that period. Some believers suggest that Mary is not one woman but a composite, a spiritual echo of all the young lives cut short, all the dances left unfinished, all the futures stolen by accidents on dark and rainy nights. The psychological power of the Resurrection Mary legend extends beyond simple ghost story thrills. There is something deeply unsettling about the specific details that remain constant across decades of sightings. The white dress, formal and festive, suggests innocence interrupted. The dancing shoes speak of youth and joy, frozen at the moment of greatest promise. The fact that she appears on cold and stormy nights, conditions that mirror the circumstances of fatal accidents, adds a layer of tragic poetry to the tale. She is always trying to get home, witnesses say, but she can never quite make it. She is trapped in an endless loop, forever leaving the dance, forever approaching the cemetery, forever reaching for help that can never quite save her. What makes this case particularly fascinating to paranormal researchers is the sheer volume of consistent testimony across such a long time period. In the carefully maintained files of the Chicago Police Department, there are over 50 official reports of Resurrection Mary sightings, and that represents only a fraction of the total encounters. Most witnesses never contact the police, embarrassed or afraid of ridicule, but those who do come forward share remarkably similar stories. The blonde hair, the white dress, the dancing shoes, the coldness. the vanishing near the cemetery gates. These details do not vary significantly across decades and across dozens of unrelated witnesses who have no connection to each other. Skeptics, of course, have proposed alternative explanations. Some suggest the story is a form of mass hysteria, a self-perpetuating legend that causes people to interpret ordinary events in extraordinary ways. See a woman in a white dress on Archer Avenue, and your brain, primed by years of hearing the story, fills in the supernatural details. Others propose that pranksters have deliberately staged encounters over the years, perpetuating the legend for attention or amusement. But these explanations struggle to account for the physical evidence, particularly the bent bars and burned handprints of 1976. Multiple engineers and metallurgists examined the damage before it was removed, and none could provide a satisfactory conventional explanation for how the impressions were created. Today, Resurrection Cemetery remains one of the most visited paranormal sites in the United States. On cold autumn nights, particularly around Halloween, dozens of ghost hunters and curious tourists line Archer Avenue, hoping for a glimpse of the woman in white. The cemetery management has largely given up trying to discourage the attention, though they maintain strict rules about trespassing after hours. The gates that were damaged in 1976 have long since been replaced, but visitors still report strange cold spots near the entrance and unexplained feelings of being watched from within the grounds. The legend of resurrection merely endures because it touches something primal in the human psyche. We want to believe that death is not the final ending, that some part of us persists beyond the grave. But we also fear that persistence, the idea that consciousness might continue in confusion and suffering, forever seeking something it can never find. Mary, in her white dress and dancing shoes, represents both our hope and our dread. She is beautiful and tragic, sympathetic and terrifying. She reminds us that the boundary between the living and the dead might be thinner than we imagine, and that on certain nights, in certain places, that boundary might blur entirely. The road to Overtoun Bridge winds through some of Scotland's most breathtaking countryside, where the hills roll green and ancient, and the River Clyde cuts through the landscape like a silver ribbon. It's the kind of place that draws visitors from around the world, camera in hand, seeking the perfect photograph of Highland beauty. But there's something else that draws people to this particular spot, something far darker than tourism or natural splendor. This Victorian-era bridge, constructed in 1879, has become known by a name that chills even the most skeptical visitor to their core. They call it the Dog Suicide Bridge, and the statistics behind that name are more horrifying than any work of fiction could imagine. Since the 1950s, over 600 dogs have jumped from this bridge. Not stumbled, not fallen, but deliberately leaped from the parapet in what witnesses describe as an almost trance-like state. Of those 600, approximately 50 have died from the fall, their bodies discovered on the rocks 50 feet below. The others survived, broken and traumatized, but alive. What makes this phenomenon even more unsettling is the specificity of it. These dogs don't jump from random points along the bridge's span. They jump from the same spot, always on the right side, always between the last two parapets. It's as if something at that precise location calls to them, something invisible to human eyes, but undeniable to these animals. Walk across Overtoun Bridge on any given day, and you might see nothing unusual at first. The structure itself is elegant, a monument to Victorian engineering and aesthetic sensibility. Built from granite, it features elaborate Gothic detailing and spans the Overtoun burn far below. The estate it serves, Overtoun House, looms in the background, a grand Victorian mansion that seems to watch over the bridge like a silent sentinel. On sunny days, the location seems almost impossibly beautiful. On overcast days, when the Scottish mist rolls in thick and heavy, the bridge takes on a different character entirely. Something brooding and ominous that seems to press down on anyone who crosses it. But the beauty or bleakness of the day matters little to the dogs who are drawn to that fatal spot. Witnesses describe a pattern that repeats with disturbing consistency. A dog will be walking calmly beside its owner, perhaps enjoying the Highland air or the interesting scents of the countryside. Then, without warning, the animal's entire demeanor changes. Its muscles tense, its ears prick forward, Something has captured its complete attention, something at that specific point on the bridge. The dog begins to pull toward the parapet, straining against its leash with a strength that seems to come from nowhere. If the owner isn't paying attention or if the leash slips, the dog reaches the low wall and, without hesitation, launches itself over the edge. Some owners have described looking into their dog's eyes in those final moments and seeing something they can't quite explain. Not fear, but fixation. An intensity of focus that suggests the animal is seeing something, responding to something that humans simply cannot perceive. One witness, a man named David Suick, nearly lost his own life trying to save his dog. He described his golden retriever, Hendrix, as suddenly freezing on the bridge, staring at something invisible, and then lunging for the parapet with such force that David was pulled along. The dog went over. David managed to catch himself, but he watched in horror as his beloved pet fell to the rocks below. Hendrix survived, but David says he'll never forget the look in his dog's eyes just before the jump. It wasn't the expression of an animal in distress. It was the expression of an animal that had seen something it desperately wanted to reach. Even more disturbing are the cases of dogs that have survived the fall, recovered from their injuries, and then jumped again when their owners, perhaps believing lightning couldn't strike twice, returned to the bridge. One such case involved a collie that leaped, survived, and then broke free from its owner months later to jump a second time. The pattern, the compulsion, seems to override even the memory of the trauma and pain from the first fall. What could possibly exert such power over these animals? Scientists and researchers have proposed several theories over the years, attempting to bring rational explanation to this deeply irrational phenomenon. The most popular scientific theory involves mink. The burns and woodlands below the bridge are home to a population of American mink, invasive species with a distinctive scent. Some researchers believe that dogs, with their powerful sense of smell, become so overwhelmed by this scent that they lose all sense of danger and simply follow their noses over the edge. It's a plausible explanation, supported by animal behavior experts who note that hunting breeds seem to be overrepresented in the statistics. Another theory focuses on acoustics and the structure of the bridge itself. Some researchers have suggested that the bridge might amplify certain sounds that are audible to dogs but not to humans. These sounds, combined with the visual effect of the burn far below being obscured by the bridge's solid granite sides, might confuse dogs about the actual height of the drop. Unable to see the ground and drawn by mysterious sounds, the dogs might believe they're jumping down a short distance rather than plunging 50 feet to the rocks below. These explanations are neat, scientific, and comforting in their rationality. But they don't explain everything. They don't explain why this happens at Overtoun Bridge, and virtually nowhere else in the world. Scotland has many bridges with similar construction, and other locations have populations of mink. But there are no other sites with anything approaching the same horrific statistics. They don't explain the specificity of the spot, always the same side, always between the same two parapets. They don't explain the dogs that jump twice, returning to the exact same location despite their previous trauma. And most significantly, these scientific theories don't explain her. The woman in white. Lady Overtoun herself. Lady Overtoun, born Emily White, became mistress of Overtoun House when she married John Campbell White, a wealthy chemical manufacturer, in 1863. By all accounts, the couple seemed happy, devoted to each other and to their Christian faith. But happiness can be as fragile as spun glass. Lady Overtoun gave birth to a son, her only child, but the boy did not survive. The details of his death remain unclear, lost to time and the privacy that Victorian society afforded to grief. What is known is that Lady Overtoun never recovered from the loss. In an era when mourning was practically a public performance, with strict rules about how long one should wear black and when one might return to society, Lady Overtoun's grief exceeded all social expectations. She took to wearing white mourning clothes instead of the traditional black, a choice that marked her as different, perhaps even strange, in the eyes of her contemporaries. White had been worn for mourning in earlier centuries, particularly for children and unmarried women, but by Lady Overtoun's time, it was decidedly unusual. She would walk the grounds of the estate in her white garments, a ghostly figure moving through the gardens and across the bridge, lost in memories of the child she had lost. Staff and visitors grew accustomed to seeing her pale form drifting along the paths, always alone, always silent. Lady Overtoun continued these walks until her death in 1908, when she passed away at the age of 71. Her husband had predeceased her, dying in 1908 as well, though accounts differ on whether she outlived him by months or whether they died within days of each other. Either way, their deaths marked the end of an era for Overtoun House. But according to locals, it did not mark the end of Lady Overtoun's walks. People began reporting sightings of a woman in white on the bridge, a figure that would appear for just a moment before vanishing into the Highland mist. At first, these reports were sporadic, the kind of ghost story that every old estate accumulates over time. But then the dogs began to jump, and a pattern emerged that turned local legend into something far more sinister. Witnesses claim that Lady Overtoun appears just before a dog jumps. Not every time, but often enough that locals have learned to watch for her. They describe seeing a pale woman in white standing near the parapet, her face turned toward the house she once called home. Dogs, they say, see her too. The animals become transfixed by her presence, drawn to her as if she's calling them, beckoning them to join her in whatever gray realm she now inhabits. And then, before the owner can react, before anyone can intervene, the dog leaps, following the white lady into the air, crashing down to the rocks, where so many others have fallen before. One witness, a woman who visits the bridge regularly as part of her dog walking route, despite knowing its reputation, describes an encounter that left her shaken to her core. Her terrier, usually obedient and calm, suddenly began whining and pulling toward the parapet. The woman looked up and saw, just for an instant, a white figure standing at the spot where her dog was trying to reach. The figure wasn't solid, she says, but it wasn't quite transparent either. It was there, undeniably present, and then it was gone. Her dog continued to strain toward the spot for several minutes afterward, whimpering and pawing at the ground, desperate to reach something she could no longer see. Skeptics, of course, dismiss these sightings as the product of suggestion and fear. People expect to see a ghost on the notorious dog suicide bridge, so their minds manufacture one from tricks of light and Highland mist. But this dismissal doesn't account for the consistency of the descriptions or the fact that the sightings predate the bridge's modern notoriety. People were seeing the White Lady long before the internet made Overtoun Bridge internationally famous, long before documentaries and paranormal investigation shows descended on the location. What draws Lady Overtoun's spirit to this place? Those who believe in the supernatural suggest that her grief, never properly resolved in life, anchors her to the estate and particularly to the bridge. Perhaps she walks there still, searching for the child she lost, unable to accept that he has gone beyond her reach. And perhaps dogs, more sensitive to spiritual presences than humans, see her and respond to that grief. Maybe they're drawn to comfort her, or maybe, in some terrible way, she draws them, seeking companionship in her eternal loneliness. The local authorities have taken the phenomenon seriously enough to install warning signs and higher barriers in recent years, urging dog owners to keep their pets on short leashes when crossing the bridge. Some people avoid the location entirely, taking longer routes rather than risk exposing their animals to whatever presence haunts that spot. But the jumps continue. As recently as 2019, dogs have leaped from Overtoun Bridge, adding to the grim statistics that have accumulated over more than 7 decades. Standing on that bridge today, looking down at the Overtoun burn 50 feet below, it's impossible not to feel the weight of all those deaths, all that accumulated tragedy. The scientific explanations feel thin and inadequate when you're actually there, when you can feel the strange heaviness in the air, the sense that something is watching, waiting. And if you're very unlucky, or perhaps very fortunate depending on your perspective, you might catch a glimpse of her yourself. A flash of white at the edge of your vision, a pale figure standing where no one should be, a presence that shouldn't exist but somehow, impossibly, does. The Dog Suicide Bridge remains one of Scotland's most disturbing mysteries, a place where the natural and supernatural seem to intertwine in ways that resist easy explanation. Whatever the truth behind the phenomenon, whether it's mink scent, an acoustic confusion, or the restless spirit of a grieving mother, one thing remains certain. Dogs continue to die at Overtoun Bridge, and the White Lady continues to walk, her mourning as eternal as the Scottish hills that surround her former home. Across thousands of miles, separated by oceans and centuries, people who have never met tell the same story. A woman, in white. A rainy night. A lonely road. Water pooling on asphalt, headlights cutting through fog, and there she stands at the edge of something, always at the edge. A bridge. A curve where the pavement meets the river. The shoulder where solid ground gives way to marsh. She appears in liminal spaces, those thin places where one world bleeds into another, where life brushes against death. The details shift with geography and language, but the core remains unchanged. She is always dressed in white, always associated with water, always connected to tragedy. In Mexico, La Llorona weeps by rivers. In the Philippines, the White Lady haunts Balete Drive after rain. In Ireland, banshees wash burial shrouds in streams before death arrives. In America, Resurrection, Mary walks near cemeteries on wet autumn nights. These stories emerged independently, sprouted from different soil, yet they bloom into the same haunting flower. Why white? Why water? Why women? Perhaps we create what we need to see. Human minds seeking patterns in chaos, building narratives around ambiguous shadows glimpsed through rain-streaked windows. Cultural constructs projected onto the world, giving shape to our collective anxieties about injustice, about women wronged and forgotten, about deaths that come too soon and leave too much unfinished. We tell these stories because we need them, because something in us demands that tragedy leave a mark on the world, that suffering echo beyond the grave. But then there are the witnesses. Thousands of them. People who had never heard the legends until their own hands gripped steering wheels in sudden cold, until their own voices caught in their throats at the sight of her. Something happened to them on those dark roads, something they cannot forget and cannot explain. We have documented the encounters. We have listened to the witnesses. We have examined the evidence, such as it is. Strange photographs, unexplained cold spots, stories that align too perfectly to dismiss, yet remain too ethereal to prove. And still, we don't know. We don't know why she wears white, why she chooses certain souls to witness her appearance, or what message she carries across the veil between worlds. Perhaps on the next rainy night, when you round that curve and see her standing there, luminous and impossible, you'll be the one who finally understands what she's been trying to tell us all along. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on the screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.